everyone, so this is a revision video for Blake's London. So what we're going to do is we're going to go through sort of key ideas for AO1, key analysis for AO2, any like interesting patterns, romantic features, characteristics of Blake, and we'll also be going to be looking at really specific context as well, so I feel like that is the way that we get better at Blake, kind of using that context to build our ideas and analysis, and using some lovely crit as well to help build those ideas up too. So I'm going to share my screen now so you guys can see what I have on here. There we go, that won't be a minute. There we go. So let me just make this a little bit bigger as well so you guys can see it. So in terms of your crit, I think that this one from Roti is really good. So Roti said that Blake's London is a bitter lament for the moral and political conditions of London. So it's going to work very well for a number of different questions, particularly any questions that are about Blake allowing us to see the world anew, offering critiques, criticisms, offering us the opportunity to see the world with kind of new eyes as well. So that would be a really nice way of looking at it. So a bitter lament for the moral and political conditions of London. And this is quite interesting as well. And again, you can kind of use this as crit, or you can just use some of these ideas as your own in your writing as well, particularly because obviously it's an exam, it's fine to do that. So Mark Scorer years ago remarked that although Blake could see spiritual realities within natural objects and could impose spiritual realities upon nature, in his early poems he tends to illuminate facts by vision. And he does that really well in London, doesn't he? So the speaker is kind of walking through the streets of London, listening, but he's also this kind of like prophet type figure, isn't he? And the midnight of London seems to be metaphorically kind of this moral, political darkness. And this prophet, he's sort of hearing the facts and conditions of the city and passing judgment on them. And we could argue that perhaps that is Blake. He's aware of kind of the venereal diseases, the sexual diseases, but he's also aware that it's a curse inherited in the blood. And he talks about how that blasts the child and his crying and blights it plagues the institution of marriage and the mothers who must carry this as well. So it is very much about not just what's happening within that moment, but how this curse, these venereal, these sexual diseases, how these are going to be kind of passed down through sort of generations as well, and how it's almost a plague on the institution of marriage too, which is quite an interesting concept in itself. But I guess the question we have to ask is he actually blaming the prostitutes? Because as we know with Blake, he is very much a fan of the underdog characters, or just general underdogs in society. He tends to be more kind of sympathetic towards those who are deemed to be less powerful or more influential. And this is quite interesting. So I thought we'd have a little look at it as well. So this was in relation to the sick rose, and it talks about it being an investigation into the taboos surrounding sex in his age that Blake undertook. And it was well known that he regarded like the Pauline Christian attitude towards sex as really unhealthy and as the cause of a lot of abnormality as well. He argues that it kind of warped the natural sexuality of young men and women, and that it corrupted family life, and that it led to prostitution and venereal disease as well. So he's essentially blaming this church, isn't he? He's blaming religious ideals and religious practice and saying that, well, this enforced celibacy, unless you are seeking to create children in marriage, it's the cause of kind of sexual prurience in the church itself. And in his poetry, it's quite a frequent thing that he does. He kind of attempts to expose this diseased attitude to sex, and he's kind of saying, well, by us being so prohibitive and being so controlling in relation to sex, which he arguably sees as something quite natural and quite beautiful, it's actually causing kind of literal and metaphorical disease. So I don't think that Blake is blaming the prostitutes. I think that this is very much a criticism of the church and religious practice, and that making its way within marriages as well. And that was the kind of cause of this kind of sexual malady, this sexual disease as well. So a really interesting reading, and one that we can use context to create as well. And when we look at the poem as it starts, it talks about how this prophet-like figure, how he wandered through each charted street. And the actual process of charting is quite interesting. It means to chop up, to map out. And when cities kind of established or were established by charter, it essentially is kind of taking free open spaces and giving them to people, giving people ownership and entitlement and privilege over those places as well. So again, it is very much going away from what Blake's kind of natural belief system would be, which would be in kind of freedom and equality, and the idea that kind of giving away this world that belongs to everyone, and then giving ownership to the pieces of that world to people that were seen as more privileged in society, which probably would have been an act of cronyism. So, giving pieces away to friends or people they were kind of politically affiliated with as well. And in terms of your context, you could do some really, really good stuff with this as well, because like we talked about, it is very much a criticism. So I think he is criticising the act of chartering. And some people believe that it's an allusion, so a reference to Thomas Paine's Rights of Man. And the book argued in favour of the principles of the French Revolution, and Paine makes a remark that maybe informs Blake's use of chartered here, and he says every chartered town is an aristocratical monopoly of itself. So he's kind of saying that the layout and organisation of a city, it reflects this imbalance of power which is concentrated in the hands of a small ruling class. And he makes another comment echoed in this poem. It is a market where every man has his price and where corruption is common traffic. And it does echo the poem's suggestion that everyone in London, from the chimney sweeps to the prostitutes, has no choice but to sell themselves to survive, because the power and the wealth is concentrated elsewhere and they have no way of accessing it. Interestingly as well, if we're thinking about what Blake is trying to critique or admonish, which is a really lovely word to use instead of critique as well, he was writing at a time when the Industrial Revolution was at full pace too. So we're sort of looking at a way of which we're going to restructure society that he believed would make people kind of lose sight of what it means to be human. He wasn't really a particular fan of it. So we could argue that he's also using London to argue that the urban environment, which is arguably growing and spreading, it's kind of inherently oppressive as well, and it's denying people the freedom to live kind of happy, joyful lives, celebrating romantic ideals, rather than the Industrial Revolution, capitalisation, things to do more with like monetary worth rather than natural well-being and natural enjoyment as well. And this is quite an interesting, quite a unique feature of this poem. So this particular feature, it refers to a figure of speech where we have a word or a phrase repeated in a sentence, but the word or phrase means something different each time it appears. So I quite like this one, and he says, doesn't he, I mark in every face I meet marks of weakness, marks of woe. And to mark in every face I meet is almost like to see it, like to notice it. But then it's also the idea that they have been marked, almost like they've been sort of branded as weak and as full of woe and sadness. This idea that they've been kind of plagued by the city and the ideologies that the city is built on. This idea that's almost like kind of tattooed upon them and there's no escape from it. They've almost been disfigured by it. So that's quite an emotive feature really for Blake to be using here. And in terms of how you might write about it, this would be a really nice way of bringing it together. So we could say that Blake's London could be an admonishment of, and that could be an admonishment of the practices of the church regarding sex. It could be an admonishment of the Industrial Revolution. It could be an admonishment of the act of chartership and elitism and the kind of unbalance of power in society. And Blake adopts that wandering persona, this prophet-like figure who reflects on the depraved and oppressive state of London. He repeats the pre-modifying adjective chartered when describing London's streets and Thames. And then we could talk about, couldn't we, how that is an allusion to, then if we go back, Thomas Paine's The Rights of Man, so we can get some lovely, lovely context in there, and then talk about what it could be read as, what's the deeper meaning. And then after examining London's environment, he shifts his focus to the faces that exist within it. And characteristically, like we've talked about before, we want to bring that in. Characteristically, he uses simple imagery with ambiguous meaning when he again adopts repetition to create an imagery of permanence using the noun marks. And like we've just talked about with that really interesting feature, the antinouclesis, he could be crafting it to directly critique, and that could be government, society, a shift in change in social attitudes. So I've tried to kind of keep this quite open so then you can sort of go in your own direction with it. But hopefully by looking on that PowerPoint, that's given us like the key ideas of the poem, it's given us the most important kind of quotes to zoom in on, pull apart, and it's also given us some really important context, in particular the context about the church, sexual depravity, and the reference